Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are around the world. I'd like to introduce David Sabine, who is one of our Scrum.org professional Scrum trainers, who's going to talk to you today about Scrum Teams, our self-organizing. Get over it. My name's Eric Neighberg, and I'm Vice President of Marketing and Operations here at Scrum.org, and I will be your host today. So Dave, next slide. So just some quick guidelines. Please ask your questions. You'll see on the GoToWebinar little portal there how to ask those questions. Type them in. We'll take them potentially throughout, and as well as certainly at the end, and follow up with any questions we're not able to get to depending on timing. Next slide, David. So just briefly, who is Scrum.org? For those of you new to this series, Scrum.org is founded by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. He continues to be our chairman and heavily involved with the organization, where we focus in three areas. One, and probably the most important one, is education. Helping people learn, helping people grow, and helping people evolve. Constantly putting out new content, new materials, and new ideas out into the market to help you. We'll talk a little bit about some of our learning paths and some other things at the end, but really getting as much information to you at no cost, for free, as this webinar is, to help continue your learning, as well as experiential training. So in-person training to really help you learn and dig deep and work with our professional Scrum trainers, as David is one, to help you continue your learning, and then certification around the different ideas in Scrum. Next slide. So with that, I will let David introduce himself, as he can do a much better job than I can, and enjoy this session. David?
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and thank you all for joining. Also behind the scenes, I would also like to thank Lindsay. So by way of introduction, my name is David Sabine, and I live in Canada. I'm a professional Scrum trainer and quite honored to be part of the PST community and the Scrum.org community. You can reach me online. I'd be happy to be in contact with any or all of you. My email address is on screen. I'm happen to be the owner of Scrum.works domain name, so you can reach me there. Also Scrum.org/David Sabine, and at Twitter or LinkedIn. I like both of those platforms. My training focus, just for your awareness, is currently the Professional Scrum Master and Professional Scrum Foundations class, which I offer across Canada. And I'm speaking at various conferences, some of which Scrum.org support. So there's the Montreal Agile Tour coming up. If you want to meet me there, that would be fantastic. And I think Scrum.org members will be there as well. And I guess, Eric, shall we just jump in?
Yeah, let's get started.
Great. Yeah, so thank you for joining the discussion. I've hosted this discussion in live settings before, and so I'm used to having some dialogue throughout. But so please do submit some questions along the way, and use the chat panel here to submit questions. Eric will help curate some of those comments and things, and I'd like for this to be a dialogue, even though that's kind of limited given our medium. But to begin, let me say that I think a utopian team is one in which we achieve unity of action, either despite the diversity of views or due to the diversity of views that the individuals within the team hold. And this is a real challenge in team leadership. How do we achieve unity of action? And when I think carefully about that, I'm reminded that teams are self-organizing. And I assert that this is objectively true. So I want to spend a little time here just to lay out my argument. And if you'll bear with me, then hopefully that'll form a foundation for questions and some dialogue. But if I assert that it's objectively true that teams are self-organizing, I think it's important that I defend what I mean by true or what I mean by truth. And so there are different ways to make truth claims. And I'll cover briefly 3 of those ways. One way that I might make a truth claim would be as a tautology. So a tautological truth claim is one that is true in every possible interpretation. And so, for example, this is a sentence from the Scrum Guide. Self-organizing teams choose how best to accomplish their work. This statement cannot be false in any interpretation. It's always true. Therefore, it's, we can put it in the category of tautological truth claims. But there's another hint here that reveals why this statement is a tautology, and that's that there's some redundancy, actually. So, for example, I could say self-organizing teams accomplish their work. And note that I have not changed the meaning of the sentence at all. Also, I could say teams choose how best to accomplish their work. And again, I haven't changed the meaning of this sentence at all. And so this redundancy is a kind of hint that this may be a tautology. There's another example I'll share. Pilots navigate their planes. Yeah, of course they do. I could say we pilot the plane or we navigate the plane. And again, there's this redundancy in the sentence, which gives us a hint that this may be a tautology. But not all tautologies have this redundancy. Here's a sentence which doesn't have this redundancy, that there's no hint here of redundancy. So the sky is blue. Well, of course it is, because we say it is. We decided that that color is going to be called blue, and therefore that's the color of the sky. There's no way that this sentence cannot be untrue. There's another kind of truth claim. So by the way, this tautology, this is not the argument I'm making when I say that teams are self-organizing. So I'm not making a tautological truth claim. Another example of a truth claim would be a dictum. This is a pronouncement, usually by some sort of authority, and it's often like a statement of principle. For example, we might say, Scrum teams are self-organizing because the Scrum Guide says so. That's just how Jeff and Ken want the world to look. So they decided it, right? And but again, this is not the argument that I'm making. When I say that Scrum teams are self-organizing, I'm not pronouncing that as an authority, as though that's the principled position that I want in the world. Another example of a dictum would be if I were to say Agile teams are self-organizing because the Agile Manifesto says that that's best. Right? Again, that's a kind of principled pronouncement. And this is not the argument that I'm making. It's not the kind of truth claim that I'm stating. I am making an argument that teams are self-organizing, and that this is an axiom. Okay. An axiomatic truth claim is a premise or starting point for all other reasoning. It's kind of like an underlying objective fact upon which we can then understand the world, or relevant to this particular discussion, we can then understand how to create an environment where teams can achieve unity of action despite or due to their diversity of individual behaviors. So I'm making an axiomatic truth claim that Scrum teams are self-organizing because I would argue that individuals have choice. And if individuals have choice, then team behavior is really the sum of its members' behaviors. And we just, I think, have to accept that as true, as objectively true. And if we accept it, then that leads to all kinds of opportunities to create environments in the workplace where teams can self-organize effectively without hindrance. And so I feel like I should also sort of defend this assertion that I'm making, that people have choice. And I don't really want to get into a discussion about whether people have free will and by the way, I'm going to borrow some material here from an author named Sam Harris. So please look him up. And I don't want to claim ownership of the next few ideas because I really owe it to that author. So when I say people have choice, I believe that wholeheartedly. And also I have to acknowledge that there are a couple of very important constraints upon our choice. So one of those constraints is that people cannot choose options that are not in their awareness or not in their experience or consciousness. I have a little thought experiment that I'd like to run with all of you. And so, maybe just for the next few minutes, really try and pay attention. Maybe put down your phone or close your laptop or whatever it might be that you're multitasking with. And just for the next couple of minutes, allow me to use you as part of the experiment. And so here we go. Ready? Please think of a city name. Think of any city. Just allow your brain to provide you with city names, and maybe some of you already have a city in mind or a few cities that are popping up in your consciousness. And what I'd like you to do is really focus on one of those city names. So maybe your brain is trying to decide between one or more, 2 or 3 of them, but really focus on just one of those cities for now. Look at it, focus on it, bring it into focus. Maybe look at it from start to finish. Maybe say it out loud. And I won't hear you, but not too loud if you're sitting in a room with other people. They might think that you're quite strange. And now, when you've got that city in focus, please discard it. Just let it go. That's the wrong city, let's say. And please think of a different city. Any city name, just not the first one that you selected. Think of a different city, bring it into focus, just look at it, read it from start to finish, maybe say it out loud. And when you've got that city in mind, please now stop. Okay, that's the experiment, by the way. You can all relax and stop. And I'd like to just reflect on this experience that we've just had together. And I think if you reflect carefully, you'll realize that your choices were limited. If in hindsight you look at the city names that popped into your awareness, you might, in hindsight, assign some probability to those. Like it's probable that whatever city you're currently in, maybe that showed up for you. Or maybe the city where you were born, or the city where you went to university, or the city where you work, or a favorite city that you've traveled. And maybe those cities have popped into your consciousness. And in hindsight, we can understand that, well, of course, those would appear in our consciousness. But there's really no explanation why some cities did not show up for you in your consciousness. Of course, there's a whole bunch of cities worldwide that you don't even know about. And of course, those could not show up in your consciousness. But there are some cities that you certainly know about, and they didn't appear. Your brain didn't present them as options for you to consider. And so, for example, there's no reason why Edmonton didn't show up for you, or St. Petersburg, or maybe Melbourne. Like, why didn't that show up when I asked you to think of city names? Well, it didn't show up because what tends to happen is that our brains immediately give us a small set of options that it wants us to consider. And so those options become part of our awareness, our consciousness. And if I were to let that experiment go for another 2 hours, that set of options wouldn't really grow much over time. like you'd have to perform some effortful thought to expand that pool of options over time. And so really, what I'm trying to highlight here is that the pool of options that are available for us to choose is finite, and very limited to our current, not only our experience in our life, but our experience in the moment, in the present moment. So thank you for bearing with me through that thought experiment.
So, hey, David,
Sure.
sorry to interrupt. There's a question that kind of seems appropriate right now based on the picture that you just saw, actually, just
Sure.
showed. So Rajesh asks a question, yeah, how do we motivate Scrum teams for self-organization, especially if they're remote and distributed?
It's an interesting question because how we motivate individual team members, I would argue, is um, irrespective of the team shape. So whether the team members are dislocated across multiple geographies or that they're co-located in a single geography, I would argue that the motivation of those individual team members is in part due to the strength of the vision set forth by the product owner, and also the environment that leaders of those teams can provide such that the individual team members can do good work. So if the vision is strong and the environment allows me to do excellent work, I know that I'm motivated. And of course, I'm borrowing some of that answer from Daniel Pink, whose literature is some of the best known literature about individual motivation. So he talks of purpose and mastery and autonomy. And so I'm translating that into a product owner's strength of communication to help the individual team members understand the vision of the product, and then as well, reflect on the work environment, allowing people to operate autonomously to some degree, and I'll get into that to some degree. Like I want to get into why that phrase was important there in that answer. So thank you for the question, Rajesh. Eric, is there another that we'd like to dig into right now?
Yeah, there's an interesting one that kind of ties to it, so I'll hit
Sure.
that one, which is someone saying, I keep hearing from people, or it actually says from trainers, that Scrum is not for remote teams. Is there any truth to that? And I'll preface this with saying I hope these aren't our Scrum.org official professional Scrum trainers, because we know that's not the case. Perfect team, of course, the more co-located we are, the better we can communicate, but there's no reason I use Scrum. I live here, and most of my Scrum teams distributed all over the world. So your take on that, David?
Yeah, sure. And let's not. So I appreciate the questions, and but it is a bit of a bird walk from our original theme. But I do appreciate the question, and I'll answer it. Scrum does not require co-located teams. Scrum does remind us that we do not. Scrum, the design of Scrum, does not acknowledge sub-teams. And so one might argue that a collection of people in one geography and another collection of people in another geography are sub-teams. And but let's understand the reason why Scrum in its design does not acknowledge sub-teams. The initial reason, of course, was based on skills separation. So we don't acknowledge a BA group separate from a tester group, separate from a development team member group, or sorry, a developer, a coder group. And because those group separations, those sub-teams create a lot of handoffs, which then create some risk and some brittle communication and some delay. And so if in your geographically dislocated team shape, you have handoffs and you have delay as a result of those handoffs, or you have brittle communication as a result of those handoffs, I would argue, obviously, the dislocation is causing some dysfunction, and it may be worth bringing those people together into the same physical location, at least temporarily, to help them coordinate better. So back to Eric's point, while Scrum doesn't require that team members are in the same physical geography, when there's dysfunction, I would argue it's a smart thing to look at. And as a trainer, I've often advised teams to acknowledge how their geographic dislocation may be at play with respect to some of their dependencies and some of their difficulties. I know that maybe that sounded like a non-answer. Like on one hand, I'm saying Scrum doesn't require it. On another hand, I'm saying it's a good idea, certainly to co-locate temporarily at least, so that. But I think both of those responses can live in harmony, and we just have to be careful about the balance. Thank you for the question, Eric.
Great, thanks, David. Why don't we continue?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to get back to this notion that our personal individual choices are constrained to some degree, and I've hopefully demonstrated that one of those constraints is actually just our experience and our consciousness. But another constraint that is very real is the idea that we cannot choose the team that we join. So, for example, I can't choose tomorrow to join the Rolling Stones. As much as I'd love to do that, that is not a choice that's available to me. And so we have to acknowledge that the best that I could do would be try to earn an invitation into the team. And at some point, maybe if I'm a roadie or I work for the, as a drum technician or something for Charlie Watt, then maybe I'd earn an invitation to join the Rolling Stones. And then at that point, I have choice. I can either accept the invitation or decline the invitation. So this constraint is going to come up in some of the next examples. So I thought it would be useful to give some example of what choice behavior looks like in a team. The first example, I'm just going to simply call it navigation. And I'd like all of you to think carefully now about a circumstance in which either maybe you or someone you know has changed jobs within a company, if possible. So it's internally within a corporation, someone has moved from one job to another job. And if we think carefully about how that took place, we can probably realize that that person moved jobs for one of two good reasons. One reason might be that they are on a professional development path. Their goals include maybe exploring different skills or exploring different mandates, and climbing a corporate ladder or whatever it is. And so they've served in one capacity while trying to earn an invitation to serve in another capacity. And when that invitation is made available to them, they then have a choice to accept the invitation or decline the invitation. So the other good reason that people will move from one job to another may be that they are discontent, or they're not happy in one setting. Maybe a new manager has been installed above them, or their mandate has changed, or they're not happy with the project or product that they're working with, and they then seek some other mandate. And in those settings, again, what's happening is someone is, for a different reason, but their actions are similar. They try to create or earn an invitation to move into another role within the company. Now, the reason I'm describing it as a choice of the individual employee to earn and then accept another invitation is to highlight that it is not in those settings that there's some puppet master manager moving an employee from one place to another. That's actually not what's happening. Managers may try, or they think that they can move staff, reassign them, But what they're actually doing is they're opening an option and maybe trying to close an option for an employee. They're going to close this option and open this one, hoping the employee will go across. But we have to always remember that the employee has choice. And one of those choices would be to decline the invitation, or one of those choices might be to leave the organization entirely, and so on. There's another example of choice behavior that I think is important to talk about, because when we're trying to lead agile teams or create an environment where agile teams can thrive, we sometimes encounter toxic behaviors, such as self-destruction. So recently I've been observing a number of teams, and there are a couple of instances where some team members are really struggling to contribute. They're really struggling to stay engaged with the team. They're really struggling to accept the team agreements or abide the team agreements. And what's happening, well, one way to look at it is that what's happening is that the environment is causing one of its members to detach, right? So, and a lot of people treat this problem as though it's the environment problem. And it may be, there may be toxins within the environment, but that's not always the case. And I think it's important to acknowledge the responsibility that we must assign to each individual here. And in some cases, an individual, despite a healthy environment, needs to take some responsibility for their own self-destructive toxic behavior. And those examples, again, would include not abiding the team agreements. I find that to be quite toxic, or detaching, or not contributing, and so forth. There's another example of choice behavior that I'd like to share here. And so I'm going to try to draw on my screen if you want to pay attention. But this is a story about two teams in the same company. This is a real, based on true events. A few years ago, I was in one of the teams. So there's me and some of my teammates together. And what happened is we were all co-located in Toronto. And then one of the team members moved to Vancouver. And we continued to operate as a team with one of those members dislocated. And we started to notice a pattern that this member over here was picking up items from the sprint backlog and not getting them done, and not being really open about that either. But we'd start reaching the end of the sprint, and the rest of the team would have to pull long hours to get something over the finish line, so to speak. And then it would come up at retrospective, and the team would say, "Hey, is there a problem? Is there something we can help with?" And this team member here would say, "No, everything's fine. I'll do better next time. Next sprint, I'll take care of it. Don't worry." But then the pattern would happen again in the next sprint. This person would pick up items in the sprint backlog and not get them done. Other team members would feel like they've got to put in some extra effort to get those items across the finish line, and it would come up at retrospective and so forth. Now, this pattern continued for a while, and in the company, we had a policy that every 3 months, we would bring all of our remote staff back to Toronto. So now you can imagine we're together again in Toronto, and the interactions are completely different now because people are having meals together, people are going to a movie in the evening together, they're playing board games, they're hanging out during lunch hours. The whole dynamic changes, of course. And you can imagine that we're now in a retrospective and we're co-located again. And the retrospective dynamic is now really different. And we achieve a kind of new realization here. And what happened was the team members really started to challenge this Vancouver resident who's now in Toronto, remember? And what we learned is that this teammate of ours was due to the move to Vancouver, was going through a lot of really difficult personal issues, in their relationship and with their finances, and the move has been really difficult for them. So the conversation changed in that retrospective from, hey, how can we help and what's the problem, to how can we help? Like, my gosh, what can we do to help you, really? And so what happened over time is that the team provided that team member a lot of latitude and support, both in terms of the work, but also personally. And I would say over the course of 3 or 4 months, things started to turn around, and some of that difficulty following the move sorted itself out. And I'd argue that, that story has a really happy ending. In another team in the same company, almost at exactly the same time, the same pattern began, right? So this one team member was picking up items in the sprint backlog and not getting them done, and not being really open about it in daily Scrum, not identifying the fact that the sprint goal is in jeopardy. And then at the last hours or days of the sprint, the other team members would have to work some long hours, or pull off some heroic actions to get things over the finish line, and so on. And the pattern, then it would come up in retrospective, and no, don't worry, I'll do better next sprint, and so on. And the pattern continued for a number of sprints. And then ultimately what happened in this team environment, during one of the retrospectives, and by the way, it takes a lot of courage and openness for teams to have these kinds of difficult decisions. But ultimately, in one of their retrospectives, the team expressed their distrust. Like, look across the table at your teammate and say, I don't trust you. What they realized in this retrospective was that this particular team member, every waking moment, this person was doing math. This person was so enthused with data visualization and algorithm development and hard math, that's really where their passion was. And the team's mandate was not that at all. The team's mandate was to build big corporate websites. And so what they realized in this moment, in this retrospective discussion, was that this particular team member was so demotivated by their mandate, they couldn't allow this member to remain in the team. What they decided to do in that retrospective was that they were all going to write recommendation letters. They were all going to reach out to their networks to help this developer, who was an excellent developer, by the way. They were going to help this person get a new job. And so this was an example of, I would say, commitment within the team. And the most compassionate way to address this problem was to help this member leave the team. And so I'm bringing these two examples forward here to highlight the fact that these patterns began almost identically. And in a typical work environment, I would worry that both of those patterns would end up maybe with both of those members would get fired from the team. And both of those members might be fired without compassion and without honor. But in these particular stories, I would say both of these teams, due to the fact that the work environment really enabled autonomous team decision-making, self-organization, both teams found the most compassionate to address the problem. I'll pause here for a question. Eric, I wonder if there's anything pertinent to the recent material.
Yeah, I think there are a few. There's a great question here. What are some signs or characteristics that tell you that a team is self-organized? And I think some of the examples that you just gave are exactly that, but are there other things that you have?
Yeah, so I'd like to sort of rephrase the question in a sense. The team is self-organizing. Like, that is never not true. And I think what you're asking there is what sort of evidence would we see? Well, we would see maybe some team members are showing acts of leadership, like offering ideas to the team. Sometimes a team member would express strife or struggle, and that's a choice behavior from an individual which affects the sum total of all the behaviors within the individuals and therefore the team. Other evidence of self-organization would be someone quits, or or someone goes and plays ping pong for 3 hours in the middle of a sprint with a teammate, whether or not the sprint goal is in jeopardy in that moment. Or so, Eric, I'm not sure if I'm really hitting upon the question there. Maybe some feedback from you would be helpful.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on part of it. I think and I think you hit on it in kind of your other examples too. I think that the question that's really being asked is, do you see examples? What examples are you seeing that the team is self-organizing? And I think some of the things around how they're working together, that they're making decisions, right? They're not being forced into roles or forced into what they do, but they're making decisions as a team rather than relying on management, which actually leads to another question here. How do traditional managers or team leads fit into a world where a team is self-organizing? Is there a slight conflict there? How do they fit in? How is that handled? And I think these questions kind of start to tie together.
Yeah, let me address that second question and I hope that I'm not skirting the question, but what's being identified there is the notion that in our work environments, there's always multiple hierarchies in play, right? There's a hierarchy of authority where you've got a manager or someone called team lead, and others that are not called manager and others not called team lead. There's another hierarchy that's really important, and that is the hierarchy of competence. Okay, and what often takes place, well, what we hope for actually is that a hierarchy of authority, which to some degree is necessary, fiduciary responsibility and so forth, and a hierarchy of competence, that these things can be in harmony. That there's over here we're acknowledging this hierarchy of competence so that we can make great decisions with respect to our architecture or our design or our code or our way of working and so forth. And this hierarchy of authority ought to not get in the way of that. That the authority hierarchy here is doing its work, which is creating a corporate legal entity in which these people can operate. That these people are helping to manage the expenditure of monies and so forth. And what I think the question is identifying is that sometimes these are in conflict. Actually, you've got maybe a team lead or a manager trying to make a decision for which they aren't competent, or which is sort of against the wisdom of the team, and that's where we have real conflict. And in most of those settings, one of two outcomes will occur. Either the team will relinquish their, they will allow themselves to be a little less self-organizing. They will relinquish some of their authority to this hierarchy over here. But let's be clear, they can take that back at any moment, right? If they decide to relinquish some of that authority temporarily, or some of their competency, that what's the word I'm looking for? They surrender some of their competence to allow this authoritative intervention. Or the other thing that can happen is that they'll revolt, in a sense. They will continue to express their competent decision and help the authoritative members of the enterprise understand maybe why their decision is suboptimal, if this is deemed optimal. So that's what I see. I see a couple of those results. The team will either relinquish their competency or express it. But let's be clear, under no circumstance do these team members here not have choice. They always have that choice, whether they choose to exercise it or not.
Great.
Back to you, Eric.
Excellent. Thank you. So here's a question. It's tied to self-organization. It's one that comes up a lot. I know it's come up a lot, in our PST community conversations as well. So that might be a good one to take, which is, who would remove a team member that's being oh my gosh, I can't say it. Disruptive or
disruptive,
or, yeah.
Disgruntled, yeah, disruptive. This is such a great question. And so you might not like this answer, but you know what? Let me carry this question. Actually, it's really related to the next material. Okay. So Eric, please make sure that I come back to that. And because I do feel that the best response is probably just to carry on through the remainder of our material together.
Perfect.
So this material I've got on screen now is the law of 2 feet, and I've stolen this, of course, from open space technology. Maybe some of you have been to open space conferences or unconferences, and this law. Well, let's go through it sentence by sentence. Every individual has 2 feet, and they must be prepared to use them. Responsibility for a successful outcome resides with exactly one person, the team member. And so what's identified here is that each team member has individual responsibility for a successful outcome for themselves, but also a successful outcome for the collective. Individuals can make a difference and must make a difference. And I think what's identified there is this notion that people need to feel that they are working with purpose, that they're making a difference. And if they don't feel that in a given situation, then they and they alone must take responsibility to use their 2 feet and move to a new place where they can make a difference. Now, this departure need not be made in anger or hostility, but only after honoring the people involved and the space they occupy. So by word or gesture, just indicate that you have nothing further to contribute, wish them well, and go and do something useful. So the law of 2 feet is really an encouragement to think critically about whether in your current space that you occupy, are you making a difference? Are you getting what you need? And if not, go somewhere else. Either, and at a conference setting, this means maybe go to another session or go to another conversation. In the work environment, I've adapted this law of 2 feet. Every employee has 2 feet, must be prepared to use them. Responsibility for a successful outcome resides with employees, individually and collectively. Employees can make a difference and must make a difference. If they cannot in a given situation, they use their 2 feet and move to where they can make a difference. Now, Eric, to your question, or to the question that was posed, I think this is the most relevant sentence. To the extent that the workplace can foster honorable relationships and interactions, their departure need not be made in anger or hostility, and employees can navigate to situations in which they can do something useful. Now, if I think on that last question, I would argue it's best if every individual in a team understands that they are responsible for the movement of their own 2 feet and that they exercise the option whenever they need to. Like if they're in a circumstance, they're unhappy, maybe the team agreements aren't compatible with their personal goals, and they really ought to take responsibility for that, and maybe they vote themselves off the team. Hey, I'm not able to contribute here in the way that I'd like. I see another opportunity, I'm leaving the team. The question, though, that was posed, Eric, is it becomes really difficult when an individual doesn't exercise that option and that they're not taking responsibility for their own behaviors. So in that setting, then my answer changes depending on the extent to which the workplace can foster honorable relationship interactions. So I've worked in some environments that are quite healthy, and people can change lanes from one team to another with not much friction. Like they can't do it on a whim, but they can do it by expressing that they'd like to work in another product, or they'd like to work on another initiative. And in that company that I'm remembering, it didn't really take long for everyone else to accommodate that somehow. Like, yeah, you'd be really well suited with that other initiative or with that product. How about our team would really like this from you before you exit, but then please exit and we'll help you. But in another setting, like an enterprise where I've been consulting recently, it's not that easy to change lanes. There's a bureaucratic framework, a legacy bureaucracy around the teams, which makes it longer and a little more difficult, but it's still possible. And I think if everyone on the line here were to think carefully in their own settings, it's still always possible for someone to move, exercise their 2 feet, either move within the company or to actually leave the company entirely. We hope that the bureaucracy provides some mechanisms to enable movement, but in some bureaucratic enterprises, that movement might take months, not weeks. But again, I would encourage everyone to realize that it is still possible. And it happens all the time. If you just think about how people move from one job to another, move up, move to a different manager, move to a different team. In some environments, that movement can take 2 weeks, and in other environments, that movement can take a year. I would argue, moving back to the next slide, and really kind of I'm rounding out now the last of my material here. I would argue that agile team leadership is really all about creating a workplace that can foster honorable relationships and interactions. And if we achieve at that, then employees can self-organize their way into circumstances where each individual and the company can thrive. So with that, I guess, Eric, please bring me back to that last question and just let me know if I should touch on it further.
No, I think you did. I think that was excellent. The big thing is let's work with the team and the individual. Hopefully, we don't need to be getting management involved, but as a team and relationship within the teams, that's what works.
Yeah, is there time, Eric? Because
Yeah,
I'd like to
we've
respond
got
actually. Because so
absolutely.
whether to get management involved is unique to every circumstance. Now, I can give example here. And recently, I've been thinking carefully about the nature of agreement in a team. And so, for example, if we were to ask ourselves, in your own workplace right now, do teams have any real teeth to fire one of their own members? And I know that that's kind of a negative way to look at it, but it highlights for us some important characteristics of the work environment. So if a team has some real teeth and some authority to manage its own team composition, then, and I've worked in environments like that, and what I've seen in those environments is that the team agreements, first of all, are difficult to make, right? Because people know that the agreement they're going to be held to that agreement by their teammates. And I think that's the way it ought to be, that we shouldn't enter into agreements just willy-nilly. It shouldn't be like if I say I'm going to do something or abide by a certain policy, I want to know in myself that I'm capable of that this agreement It isn't something I'm going to take lightly. And if I am going to make that kind of commitment to the agreements of our team, I'm going to certainly hold my team members to that agreement. Now, in some work environments, even elevating the agreements within the team may still not provide the team mechanisms by which they can hire people or fire people or hold people to account, so to speak. And in those environments, it's still possible and probably essential to look plainly at the bureaucratic mechanisms that do exist. Okay, so within the team, we're going to try to elevate our agreements, hold each other to those agreements, honor those agreements personally, and that has limits though, and we may need to exercise the option to inform a manager outside the team or escalate it in some way to a human resources department or but this is true not just of hiring and firing. This is true of attaining a training budget or attaining new tools. It's kind of relevant to everything, but I like the proposition of team composition because I think it highlights for us some important factors. Eric, I'd love to know if there are other questions and if we have time for those.
Yeah, we've got time certainly for a few more. There's lots that have come in.
Great.
So here's a good one, I think. How does one transform from asking your team to be self-organizing versus the team just being self-organizing? Any advice on kind of coaching the team and getting that to start to happen?
I like this question. So can we ask a team to be self-organizing? I don't believe we can because they already are. Probably if we stop asking and if we stop trying to assign work or specific mandates or specific process or specific architectural or design decisions and so forth, if we stop trying to impose those things on the team, then actually what happens is that we enable the self-organization within the team. We enable self-organization. As a Scrum Master, if you are a Scrum Master, I would argue one of your services to the team is to encourage self-organization, that you model it or you help the team develop the courage to exercise their own self-organization, exercise their own options and choices. And one of the ways I think of this actually is that if a team, so I've tended to trust the wisdom of teams throughout my own life. And I know that that's difficult for many others to do, but when I trust the wisdom of a team, I've almost never been disappointed in their choices or in their solutions or in their ideas. And sorry, I kind of lost my train there. But it's not easy for them to do. And one of the things I would remind people is that teams always have power, but sometimes they don't know it. Sometimes they forget. And so I think, Eric, to the question being asked, if rather than ask the team or allow the team to self-organize, because I see that phrase sometimes, we just have to recognize that they will self-organize. They already are self-organizing. If only we just get out of the way, so to speak. Try to provide the team with clear mandate so that hopefully they're moving in a unified direction and help them establish strong agreements.
Thanks, David. There are a lot of questions in here that kind of tie to management and managers and those sorts of things, specifically around often there may be somebody who is or was a team lead that's on the development team. How do you handle and coach through scenarios where you've got a team lead on the development team and making sure that they're not trying to take control of the team, rather being a part of the team?
Great question. Yeah, this is a really tough one. Tough one for those individuals, right? Because if we think about how does a person earn a position as a team lead, often they've earned it um, through being competent as a developer or as it was their competence in their particular skills areas which propelled them to this position. Now, part of the question or part of the problem in a team environment is that other team members may not see that competence. They might not have known this person's history, or maybe this person's skills are a little outdated, and some of these members don't feel that that member is competent. So the team lead really has to continue every day to earn credibility in the team. Without credibility, there's no amount of authority, appointed authority. I'm gonna make that note over here. No amount of appointed authority is going to provide this team lead with the respect they desire among their teammates. So really to focus on being credible and being competent. And I would argue also, and perhaps this is my opinion, but I think it may also be the opinion of our larger community, the Scrum trainer community and maybe the Agile community, that we as a team, as a senior or a lead member of a team, we earn credibility by encouraging autonomous or we encourage facilitative decision making among the team members, rather than authoritative or interventionist decision making. Authoritative. Sorry that I can't speak and spell at the same time. So if a person is trying to make authoritative decisions and impose those upon the team and they don't have credibility, it'll go badly every time. So as long as a team lead can kind of step back, maybe encourage the team to encourage the other members to fully participate in the decision making, and then as a team lead perhaps moderate rather than approve, or coach rather than prescribe. I think those are the keys to being a good contributor to a team as one of its senior members.
Great, thanks, David. To be conscious of our time box,
Yeah.
I think we've kind of run out of time for questions. There are a lot, and David will try to respond to those via email as we do have them. If we can move on to the next slide. I just want to be conscious of the time of our participants. So I had mentioned this earlier, but continue your learning. We've got a lot of free resources and content out on our website, including these learning paths for development team members, for agile leaders, for product owners, and for Scrum Masters. They include a lot of different articles, videos, and other areas and ways to learn to keep your learning going. We continue to update them, continue to facilitate them, and please, they're free. Go check them out. And the next slide, I just want to say thank you very much for the time today, David. Thank you to the audience. I know it's taking time out of your days as well. Keep following the Scrum Pulses, these webinars, read the blogs, lots of great content and information out there, and follow us on all kinds of social media. With that, again, thank you very much, David. Thank you, audience, and have a great day.